The Vethkai High Chorus had been screaming at Ilian for 4 minutes, and he hadn't understood a word which, as it turned out, was the only thing that saved the peace talks. The Grand Accord Chamber of Vethkai Prime was, by design, a weapon. 17 sonic registers, all operating simultaneously, each carrying a different stratum of meaning, rank, intention, emotional truth, the precise gradation of submission being offered. The architects had built the chamber's resonance into the walls themselves, so that sound didn't just fill the space, it saturated it, pressing against the bones of anyone who stood within it like a tide coming in. Other species felt it as pressure. Vethkai felt it as language. Ilian felt it as noise. Not painful noise, he'd had worse, in the early years, before he learned to modulate his hearing aids to compress the worst frequencies. Just undifferentiated roar. The specific auditory chaos that his processing disorder resolved all complex acoustic information into when the inputs exceeded a certain threshold. 17 simultaneous tonal registers exceeded that threshold considerably. His brain, confronted with the impossible task of parsing them, simply stopped trying and handed him static. He stood in the middle of the chamber and looked around. The Drassic ambassador was prostrating full-body floor contact, an elaborate sonic submission ritual being performed at volume. The Chelani delegation had gone pale and was producing a continuous low hum that Ilian's audiologist would later tell him was the equivalent of "please don't hurt us." 4 other delegations were similarly occupied with their various capitulation protocols. Ilian watched the Vethkai High Chorus watch all of this, and he noted, with the careful attention he brought to everything he couldn't hear, that the chorus master's secondary face, the one below the primary, the one Vethkai used when they thought no one was looking, was not satisfied. It was watching the room with the particular expression of someone whose bluff had been called so many times it had stopped being interesting. He kept watching. The chorus master's gaze tracked the room systematically, cataloging submissions with the mechanical efficiency of someone tallying inventory, until it reached Ilian. It stopped. Ilian had not prostrated. He had not hummed. He had not, so far as he could tell, done anything at all except stand quietly in the middle of a sonic hurricane and look back. The chorus master, the title, he'd been told, translated roughly as Verath of the Deep Chord, though his briefing materials had admitted uncertainty about whether deep was a sonic descriptor or a philosophical one, held his gaze for a long moment. Something moved through the secondary face. Not contempt. Not quite. Something more like the expression of a person who had asked a question they didn't expect to receive an answer to, and was now reconsidering the question. The formal portion of the session ended. Delegations dispersed to their assigned observation areas. Ilian was moving toward his, when a Vethkai herald appeared at his elbow and produced, in careful translated standard, 4 words. "The Chordmaster will speak." Ilian considered his options. He had no team budget cuts, had made this a solo observation mission. He had no comms relay, the Vethkai jammed everything, as a matter of sonic sovereignty. He had his briefing materials, his hearing aids, a moderate gift for reading faces, and the specific quality of nerve that came from having spent 20 years in intelligence work where the alternative to thinking fast was dying. He followed the herald. "You did not submit," Vareth said. The private chamber was smaller, the acoustics simpler, 2 registers instead of 17, and at a volume Ilian's processing could actually resolve. He could hear, though the sound was still strange. Layered in ways standard wasn't. Harmonics folded into every syllable. "Why? I'm not sure I know what submission looks like in your register," Ilian said. Truthfully. A long pause. The secondary face was doing something complex. "You did not flinch." Leverly. "I was processing," Ilian said, which was also truthful. Another pause. The secondary face had settled into the expression of someone revising a significant assumption. The others flinched. "Yes," Ilian agreed. "I noticed that. He was watching the Vethkai delegation through the transparent wall of the private chamber, watching the way they moved through the observation area in clusters, the way two distinct gravitational centers had formed, pulling people toward them with the subtle inevitability of rival magnetic fields. He'd noticed it in the main chamber, too. He'd had nothing else to do but notice things. "You noticed," Varath said. "Your third harmonic delegation," Ilian said, nodding toward the larger cluster, "hasn't made eye contact with your second in the 40 minutes since the session ended." He paused. "That's not a philosophical difference. That's a coup timeline." The silence that followed was different from the other silences. Ilian had been in enough interrogation rooms on enough sides of the table to know the difference between a silence that was thinking and a silence that was deciding. This one was deciding. Varath of the Deep Chord went very still. First time Ilian had seen a Vethkai go still. All the harmonics dropped out of the air between them. It was, he realized, the first time he'd been in a room with a Vethkai, and found it genuinely quiet. "You hear things," Varath said finally. "I read things," Ilian said. "It's a different instrument. I'm not sure it's a better one." He was watching the secondary face when he said it. And the secondary face did something he wouldn't have a word for until 3 weeks later, when a xenolinguist on the debrief team told him the Vethkai called it chord recognition, the moment of encountering another mind, tuned to a compatible frequency. "You will help me," Varath said. It was not quite a question. "I'd want to understand what I'd be helping with," Ilian said carefully. "Yes." Varath's secondary face had settled into something that, in a human, Ilian would have called weary. "I imagine you would. The summit is not about your species. Human. It never was." A pause. "It is about whether I survive the next 12 hours, and whether my people tear themselves apart before or after the other delegations reach their ships." He looked at Ilian with both faces simultaneously, which was the Vethkai equivalent of full attention. "Help me navigate this quietly," he said, "or become the incident that ends it." Ilian looked at the two clusters in the observation room, the third harmonic delegation, now very deliberately, not watching the private chamber, which meant they were watching it extremely carefully. He looked at Varath's two faces, both of them holding the same exhausted, genuine appeal. He thought about 12 hours and a coup timeline, and having no team, no comms relay, and a moderate gift for reading faces. "Tell me," he said, "everything you know about your third harmonic chorus leader's secondary expression when he's frightened." Ilian had brokered 17 diplomatic agreements in his career. But he'd always had a team, a comms relay, and at minimum, a very good sandwich. Tonight, he had none of those things. What he had was Varath's briefing, rapid, layered, occasionally interrupted by harmonic grief at the state of Vethkai politics, and his own systematic survey of every face in the Accord complex over the following 4 hours. He'd developed, over 2 decades, what his first handler had called a gift, and what his audiologist called a compensation strategy. The inability to rely on sound had sharpened everything else, until the information people carried in their faces felt, to Ilian, almost as loud as speech. Almost. The night had a way of introducing complications. The sonic weapons activated at the 3rd hour past midnight, and the complication arrived all at once. The third harmonic delegation had been patient. Ilian gave them that. They'd waited until the other delegations were in deep sleep cycles, until the complex's overnight staff had cycled down to minimum, until Varath's personal guard had rotated a rotation Ilian now recognized as having been arranged. The new guards carrying in their faces the specific flatness of people who had already made a choice and were past the point of reconsidering it. The Accord chamber sealed. 6 alien ambassadors and Varath were inside, along with Ilian, who had followed Varath from a late-night strategic session that had been running precisely because both of them had seen this coming and had not moved fast enough. The weapons came online. Ilian felt them as a shift in air pressure, a vibration in his back teeth. Everyone else in the room felt them as something considerably worse. The Drassic ambassador went down first, not unconscious, but curled, both hands pressed to the sides of his head. The Chelani delegation followed, unable to stand against what Ilian's research now told him was a disorientation frequency calibrated to the Vethkai's deep understanding of how most species processed sound. Verath, to his credit, was still upright, though both faces had gone the color of old bone. The third harmonic chorus leader, his name was Sev Ereth of the Split Chord, and Ilian had spent 3 hours memorizing his secondary face. Walked through the sealed chamber doors with 8 armed Vethkai behind him, and the expression of a man who had rehearsed this moment so many times it had stopped, feeling real. The sonic weapons continued cycling. The other delegations were down or gripping walls. Vereth was holding on through what appeared to be sheer, hierarchical stubbornness. Ilian was standing in the middle of the room, which was, he'd been told, a habit of his that colleagues found unnerving. He found it useful. It was hard to sneak up on someone who'd already identified the center of the room and stood in it. He watched Severeth's face. The primary face was doing triumph. The secondary face was doing something considerably more complicated. He crossed the room toward the coup leader, which was not what anyone expected, including Verath, who produced a sound of alarm that Ilian couldn't parse but whose meaning was fairly obvious. The weapons, Severeth said. In careful standard the Vethkai had apparently prepared for the possibility of non-Vethkai observers, are calibrated to affect all present. You should be disabled. I know, Ilian said. They're very effective. Everyone in this room is having a genuinely terrible time. He paused. Except me, which I suspect is not what you modeled. Severeth's secondary face flickered. There, it was the thing Ilian had been looking for since the man walked through the door. Not bloodlust. Not revolutionary fervor. The expression of a person who had climbed to the edge of a cliff and discovered, upon arrival, that it was much higher than the map suggested. You're frightened, Ilian said quietly. Not of me. Of what comes after this. He let that sit for a moment. You've run the calculations. You know that removing Verath tonight doesn't stabilize the chorus, it fractures it. Your faction wins, and then spends the next decade bleeding while the other harmonics regroup. The weapons were still cycling. Severeth's guard had spread through the room in a semicircle, weapons raised. And every one of them had the same secondary face reading, waiting for the order that Severeth was not giving. I know you can't hear me properly right now, Ilian said. He wasn't sure how much the weapons were affecting Severeth's own processing. Vethkai weren't immune to their own frequencies at close range. Neither can I. So let's just be 2 people who don't want anyone to die today. Severeth said something in Vethkai. Ilian didn't catch it. He read the secondary face instead. Then he turned to Vereth. The third harmonic's actual grievance, he said, is the Resource Allocation Treaty from 14 years ago. They've been carrying an unfair burden in the outer systems and they can't say so in formal chorus without it being heard as a dominance challenge. He paused. Can they say so here? Right now? To you? Is that a conversation the chorus master can have with a chorus leader, informally, with a witness who will never be able to report what was said because he can't hear it? Verath's secondary face did something extraordinary. It went, for just a moment, entirely open, stripped of hierarchy, stripped of the tonal performance that was as natural to Vethkai as breathing. Just a face. Exhausted, and underneath the exhaustion, genuinely surprised. Yes, Vereth said, that conversation can be had. It took 2 hours. Ilian spent most of it sitting on the floor of the Accord chamber with the Drassic ambassador, who had recovered enough to be miserable and wanted company. He watched the other delegations gradually return to function as the weapons cycled down. He watched Verath and Severeth talk, couldn't hear a word of it. Didn't need to. The secondary faces told him everything. At the end of the 2 hours, Severeth gave an order. His guard stood down. The sealed doors opened. The summit would resume in the morning. There would be a new resource allocation provision in the accord. Ilian would have to explain, in full debrief, exactly how he had known which grievance to name, which he was already preparing to tell, was educated inference, and not the result of 3 hours of painstaking secondary face analysis, because some methods were more useful when they stayed private. But first there was the debriefing that happened before the debrief, the one that was just him and Varath in the emptied accord chamber, the other delegations dispersed. The guards rotated back to people whose secondary faces said they hadn't recently made a different choice. Varath sat across from him. No translation technology. No sonic protocol. Ilian waited. The chorus master spoke, finally, in a register so low that Ilian's aides could actually resolve it, not static, not the undifferentiated roar of the full chorus, but something singular. A voice. Strange and layered and genuinely itself. Ilian didn't have the vocabulary for what it meant. He would later, after 3 weeks of xenolinguistics briefings and a very patient Vethkai language instructor, who was delighted to have a student with precisely his particular auditory profile. He knew what it meant now, though. The same way he'd always known things not through sound, but through the information that lived in faces, in posture, in the gap between what a person said and what they were willing to say. The same instrument that had read coup timelines in the angle of a shoulder and revolutionary doubt in a secondary expression read this without effort. He didn't have a word for what he did next. The Vethkai would write 3 philosophical texts about it. In the end, they would discuss whether it was a sonic act or something that existed outside the sonic framework entirely. Whether it constituted a new register or the absence of all registers, whether the human had been communicating or simply being. Ilian smiled. The chorus master of the Vethkai, a species that had ruled their corner of the galaxy for 400 years on the strength of their voice, that had built civilization on the premise that sound was meaning and meaning was sound, looked at that smile for a long moment. Then, carefully, with the deliberate precision of someone learning a new instrument, Varath of the Deep Chord made a face back.